Please, there's so much blood. My mama won't wake up." The voice came from nowhere, trembling, high-pitched, and filled with terror. He blinked at the long mahogany table in front of him, where half a dozen executives sat waiting for his verdict on a billion-dollar merger. Then he realized it was a child's voice, raw and desperate, cutting through the sterile air of the boardroom. Edward was 44, the kind of man who made entire markets tremble with a glance. He had built his empire through cold calculation, by never letting emotions bend his judgment. His life was schedules, reports, and acquisitions until that moment. The child's voice cracked through his composure like a chisel to stone. "Please, help us. There's blood, she won't move." His pen hovered above the contract worth billions, a merger that had taken 6 months to negotiate. His chief counsel leaned forward urgently. "Mr. Grant, we just need your signature." Edward's hand shook. The screen of his phone glowed with an unfamiliar number. For an instant, he was no longer in the boardroom. He was back in another night, years ago, standing in a sterile hospital hallway, while a doctor avoided his eyes. His wife had been driving their daughter to school when a truck veered into them. Edward had been in a meeting. He had told them he would come after. Just a few minutes later. By the time he arrived, both bodies were already cold. Too late. Always too late. Now another girl's voice pierced the air, desperate and fragile. "Mister, are you there? Please, she's not moving." Edward rose abruptly, chair legs screeching against the floor. "Meeting adjourned," he snapped, his voice iron. Gasps, confusion. No one dared move as he snatched up his phone, holding it close. "Sweetheart, tell me your name." "No." "Maya," the little voice quivered. "Maya William, Mama's bleeding. She won't wake up. People just keep walking, nobody helps." Edward was already striding into the hallway, ignoring the startled calls of his staff. "Where are you, Maya? Tell me where." She stammered out an intersection. He knew the neighborhood old storefronts, laundromats, bodegas, a world far removed from his glass towers. His pace quickened toward the lobby elevators. "Stay with your mother," he said firmly. "Don't hang up. I'm on my way." Through broken sobs, Maya William was 7 years old. She and her mother, Angela, had been walking home from the corner store when a group of men surrounded them. Their shouts filled the street, demanding money, phones, anything of value. Angela pushed her daughter behind her, shielding her small body. Then one of the men shoved Maya hard, and she stumbled into the gutter. Angela caught her, pulling her back, but in that instant, headlights roared from the opposite lane. The car struck Angela with brutal force. Tires screamed, then sped away, leaving her crumpled on the asphalt. The men scattered into the shadows. Maya, trembling, clutched her mother's hand. Blood seeped across the pavement, soaking into her shoes. She fumbled for her mother's phone, tears blurring the numbers. She tried to call her aunt, the only family she knew might answer. But her fingers slipped, the wrong sequence entered. Instead of her aunt's familiar voice, the call had landed here, in Edward Grant's hand, at the height of a boardroom meeting. And by some strange twist of fate, he had answered. Edward's chest constricted as he listened. The image of his wife shielding their daughter crashed against the picture of Angela pushing Maya aside. 2 mothers, 2 nights, 2 fates colliding across time. The boardroom no longer existed. The only thing real was the sound of a child's breath over the line and the wet silence of a woman fading on the street. Edward turned and strode out of the room without a word. His staff called after him, confused, but he no longer heard them. The elevator doors closed around him, sealing him into the weight of memory and urgency. "Maya," he whispered into the phone, though he knew she could not hear the promise forming in his chest. "This time, I won't be late." "No." Down in the lobby, he shoved past the startled doorman and into the night air. The city pulsed with indifference, yellow cabs honking, strangers rushing by, neon lights buzzing against brick. Edward's black Range Rover waited at the curb. He slid behind the wheel, hands gripping the leather with a force that left his knuckles white. He drove like a man racing not just against time but against ghosts. Skyscrapers gave way to narrower streets, polished marble towers to laundromats and bodegas, graffiti and chain-link fences flashing by in the wash of headlights. On the line, Maya's voice broke and reformed in fragments. "Mama's cold. Her eyes won't open. There's blood everywhere." Edward's heart pounded with every word. In her terror, he heard Emily, his daughter, whispering across years. He pressed harder on the accelerator. When he reached the intersection she had named, he saw them at once. A small figure crouched on the sidewalk, clutching a phone in one hand and the limp arm of her mother in the other. The pool of blood around Angela was dark and spreading, a grotesque halo against the concrete. Edward braked hard, the car lurching to a stop. He leapt out and crossed the distance in strides, his tailored shoes splashing through crimson. The girl looked up. Tears streaked her round face, her braids wild, her small body shivering in the night air. "You came," she whispered. Edward dropped to his knees beside her. The smell of iron filled his lungs. Angela's chest barely rose, each breath shallow, fragile. Blood matted her hair, streaking down the side of her face. For a heartbeat, Edward faltered, the past threatening to swallow him whole. But then the wail of approaching sirens cut through the fog, and instinct surged forward. He slipped off his jacket, folding it beneath Angela's head to lift her airway. His hand pressed firmly to the wound, warm blood seeping through fabric. "She's alive," he murmured, not to Maya, not even to himself, but to the ghosts that still haunted him. The ambulance pulled up with a shriek of brakes. Paramedics spilled out, voices crisp and urgent. They lifted Angela onto a stretcher, working quickly, wrapping bandages, inserting IV lines. One medic looked at Edward. "Are you family?" The truth perched on his lips. He was no one, a stranger. But Maya's small hand clutched his arm, fingers sticky with blood, her eyes pleading. In that instant, Edward understood. Family was not always born of blood, but of the moment you refuse to let go. "Yes," he said firmly, "I'm family. My." And as the ambulance doors slammed shut, Edward climbed in beside Maya, carrying with him not only a bleeding woman and a frightened child, but also the weight of a vow he had broken once and swore never to break again. This time, he would not be late. The sirens carved a path through the night as the ambulance sped down crowded streets. Inside, the world shrank to a rectangle of harsh fluorescent light and the steady beeping of monitors. Edward sat rigid on the narrow bench, his knees pressed against cold steel, his gaze fixed on Angela's pale form. Tubes snaked from her arms, an oxygen mask covered her face, and blood still seeped slowly despite the paramedics' frantic hands. Beside him, Maya clung to his sleeve, trembling so violently he thought her small bones might shatter. Her wide eyes darted from her mother to the paramedics, searching for answers she couldn't find. She looked so small against the backdrop of medical chaos, her braids undone, her clothes stained with her mother's blood. Edward leaned toward her, lowering his voice as though trying to steady them both. "She's still breathing. That means there's hope." Maya didn't answer. Her lips moved, but only air came out, broken words swallowed by the roar of sirens. She buried her face against Edward's arm, clutching him as if he were the last pillar holding her world upright. For years, Edward had avoided contact this raw. He had sealed himself behind glass towers, expensive suits, private jets. He had turned grief into armor, surrounding himself with contracts and numbers, the sterile order of finance. But Maya's small body pressed against him with desperate trust, and suddenly the armor cracked. He closed his eyes, and for a flash he saw Emily, his daughter, in the back seat of their family car on that winter night. He saw her frightened eyes, the confusion as men with guns banged on the windows, his wife's hand shielding her. Then headlights blazed, and everything dissolved into screaming and silence. He hadn't been there. He hadn't saved them. Now, another child leaned on him, whispering without words, "Don't leave. Don't let her die." The ambulance jolted to a stop, and the rear doors swung open to a flood of hospital lights. Paramedics rushed Angela out, the stretcher wheels clattering against the pavement. Edward followed without hesitation, Maya's hand still glued to his. They burst through sliding glass doors into the emergency department. Nurses barked orders. A doctor in scrubs met them at the threshold, and Angela vanished through swinging double doors toward surgery. Maya cried out, reaching, but Edward crouched, holding her tight. "They're taking care of her now. That's how we help her, by letting them work." Maya nodded weakly. though her tears streamed unchecked. A nurse approached, clipboard in hand. "We need insurance information." "Are you the husband?" Edward hesitated. The truth. He was no one. A stranger pulled into this nightmare by a misdialed number. But Maya's grip tightened, and the word that came out surprised even him. "Yes, I'll sign whatever you need." The nurse blinked, perhaps too busy to question further. She rattled off forms, liability notices, and estimates. The numbers were staggering, even to Edward tens of thousands just for tonight. More if surgery was required. But he didn't flinch. He scrawled his name where they pointed, initials where they demanded, his signature binding him to a responsibility he had no obligation to take. Yet it felt inevitable, as though destiny itself had pushed the pen into his hand. The nurse hurried away. Edward guided Maya to a row of plastic chairs in the waiting room. The walls hummed with the low buzz of vending machines. A television flickered in the corner, muted, showing a football game that nobody watched. Families sat in clusters, their faces pale and anxious, their whispers heavy with worry. Maya curled up beside Edward, her small fists gripping the hem of his coat. He wrapped the fabric around her shoulders, shielding her from the hospital chill. For the first time since the call, she spoke in full sentences. "We were just walking home," she whispered. "Mama bought bread and milk. The men came out of nowhere. They yelled. They pushed me. And then the car." Her voice cracked. "I tried to call Aunt Simone. I must have pressed the wrong numbers." She glanced up at him, her eyes full of something like guilt. "I didn't mean to bother you." Edward's chest tightened. Bother. As if her cry for help was an inconvenience. As if her life and her mother's life were nothing more than static on a line. He wanted to tell her she had saved them both, that she had given him a chance to undo the curse of being too late. Instead he said, simply, "You did the right thing, Maya. You called me. That's what matters." She searched his face as though trying to measure the truth in his words. Then, slowly, she rested her head against his side, her breathing uneven but steadier. Minutes stretched into an hour. Nurses came and went, their shoes squeaking across linoleum. Edward sat unmoving, his hand resting on Maya's back, his gaze fixed on the closed doors that separated them from Angela. His mind circled the same thoughts. What if she didn't survive? What would become of this child? And why did he, of all people, feel as if fate had dragged him into this moment with purpose? A doctor finally emerged, surgical cap in hand, his face grave. He explained Angela's injuries in clipped, urgent tones: severe head trauma, internal bleeding, critical condition. She would need immediate surgery. But even with it, survival was uncertain. And then came the question, who is the next of kin? We need consent to proceed. Edward glanced at Maya, who had fallen into a fitful half-sleep against his side, her small frame rising and falling with shallow breaths. No one else was here. No aunt, no relative, no friend. Just him. He rose slowly, his voice steady but edged with steel. "I'll sign. Do whatever it takes." The doctor hesitated. "Sir, you understand the risks." "I understand," Edward cut in. "I accept full responsibility." The doctor studied him for a moment, then nodded, and disappeared back through the double doors. Edward sat again, his body heavy with the weight of the decision. The smell of antiseptic filled the air, sharp and clean, yet beneath it he could still taste the metallic tang of blood on his hands. He looked down at Maya, asleep now, her lashes wet with tears. He thought of Emily, how she had clung to her mother's hand the night she died. He thought of how he hadn't been there to hold either of them. Now, he was here, and he would not leave. The waiting room clock ticked with merciless slowness. Each second was a hammer against his nerves. He tried to distract himself by observing the people around him, an older couple praying together with rosary beads, a middle-aged man staring blankly at the floor, a teenage boy scrolling his phone with shaking hands. Different lives, the same fear. Edward realized, perhaps for the first time in years, that money could not command time. It could not guarantee safety. It could only open doors. What lay beyond those doors was left to skill, chance, and God. He leaned back against the hard plastic chair, exhaustion creeping into his bones. Maya stirred beside him, her small hand instinctively reaching for his. He closed his fingers around hers, the gesture as natural as breathing, and in that moment, Edward understood the strange truth of fate. A wrong number had found him. A trembling child's plea had pierced through the fortress he had built around his grief, and for the first time since he buried his family, he felt a spark of something he thought he had lost forever. The chance to save someone before it was too late. If you feel connected to Edward's story, like this video and comment your location below. Who knows, someone near you might be watching too. The night pressed heavy against the hospital windows, neon reflections rippling on the glass. Edward sat in the waiting room with his shoulders hunched, his body stiff as stone, while Maya curled up beside him, her small frame cocooned in the folds of his coat. Around them, the room moved in fragments, footsteps echoing down polished corridors, the metallic squeak of gurney wheels, murmurs of worried families. But for Edward, there was only the closed set of double doors beyond which Angela's life hung in the balance. Time was elastic. Sometimes the seconds crawled, each tick of the clock a needle in his nerves. Other times whole minutes disappeared as he stared at the floor tiles, lost in the old ache of memory. He could see it all too clearly. His wife's pale hand reaching out. His daughter's terrified eyes. The headlights. The scream cut short. He had been late that night. Not by hours, just minutes. And those minutes had stolen his world. Now fate had twisted itself into a cruel mirror. Another woman, another child. Another night where his presence or absence would matter. The weight pressed so hard against his chest that he rose to his feet. Pacing. He told himself it was restlessness, but he knew better. It was guilt wearing the mask of urgency. Maya stirred on the chair. Her eyelids fluttered, lashes sticky with dried tears. She looked up at him, still half dreaming. "Is Mama better yet?" Edward crouched, forcing steadiness into his voice. "They're still helping her, sweetheart. Surgery takes time." She rubbed her eyes with the back of her fist, leaving a faint streak of red from her stained sleeves. "They have to make her better. She's all I've got." The words hit him like a blow. All she's got. He remembered standing by two coffins lowered into the ground, the icy wind cutting through his suit, the echo of dirt on wood. He had walked away from that grave with nothing left, only the hollow shell of a life. He placed a hand gently on Maya's small shoulder. "She's strong. And you did the bravest thing, calling for help." Maya studied him, her brow furrowed as though she were trying to measure his truth. "I called Aunt Simone, but the numbers got all mixed up." Edward's throat tightened. A wrong number. That was all it had taken to bind their fates together. One slip of a finger, one mistake, and destiny had chosen him. Before he could reply, the double doors burst open. A nurse hurried toward him, clipboard in hand, her eyes sharp with urgency. "Mr. Grant." Yes, the word came automatically. He had no right to claim it, but he carried it now as if it were armor. "The doctors need authorization for a transfusion and extended surgical measures. She's losing more blood than expected. I already signed consent. This requires additional authorization. Higher risk." Edward straightened, his gaze unflinching. "Do it. Whatever she needs." 0. The nurse scribbled notes and rushed back through the doors. Maya tugged his sleeve. "What does it mean?" "It means they're fighting to save her," Edward said quietly. He glanced at the hallway beyond the waiting room. Somewhere in those sterile rooms, surgeons battled against time, against blood and bone and fate itself, and all he could do was sit here with a child and pretend his presence was enough. Minutes stretched, elastic again. Edward resumed pacing, his footsteps tracing grooves into the tile. His mind churned with numbers, surgical odds, financial costs, years lived and years lost. But when he looked down at Maya, small and fragile in the oversized chair, all the numbers dissolved. She didn't care about odds or costs. She cared only that her mother opened her eyes again. A commotion at the entrance snapped him from thought. A woman in her 40s, hair pulled into a tight bun, stormed through the sliding doors, her coat hanging loose over her scrubs. She demanded at the desk, "Where's Angela William? I'm her sister, Dr. Simone Baptiste." Edward felt the tension ease in his chest at the sound of family. Maya leapt from the chair, running into the woman's arms with a sob of relief. "Auntie!" Simone gathered her close, holding her tight. Then her sharp eyes lifted and landed on Edward. She measured him in a heartbeat. the expensive suit stained with blood, the jaw tight with restraint, the haunted eyes of a man who had seen too much. "You are?" she asked. Edward cleared his throat. "Edward Grant. I was there when it happened." Maya, clutching her aunt's hand, added quickly, "He came, Auntie. He stayed with us. He signed the papers." Simone's gaze softened, though skepticism lingered. She nodded once. "Then thank you. You may have saved my sister's life tonight." "Bye." Edward almost corrected her, said it wasn't him. It was Maya's courage. The paramedics. The doctors. But he bit the words back. For now, what mattered was the woman still under the surgeon's knife. They sat together in uneasy silence. Simone asked questions, her medical knowledge filling in gaps Edward could not. Maya drifted between them, her small hand sometimes in her aunt's, sometimes in Edward's, as if tethering both worlds together. Hours bled away. The football game on the muted television ended and restarted with highlights. Families rotated in and out of the waiting room, some leaving with relief, others with hollow eyes. Still, Angela's fate remained sealed behind those doors. At last, the doctor emerged again, his scrubs marked with exhaustion. He looked at Simone first, then at Edward. "She made it through surgery. We managed to stop the bleeding and stabilize her. The next 24 hours are critical, but she has a fighting chance." Maya gasped, tears spilling anew. "She's alive?" "She's alive," the doctor confirmed. The words released something inside Edward he hadn't known he was holding. His knees nearly gave way with the force of it. He reached for the back of a chair to steady himself, closing his eyes. For the first time since that long-ago night, he was not too late. Simone bent to soothe Maya, whispering promises of tomorrow. Edward stood apart, silent, his hands shaking slightly. The ghosts of his wife and daughter still lingered, but tonight they had not claimed another life. Tonight, fate had bent differently. The dawn had not yet broken when the ambulance's red glow still lingered in Edward's vision. Even though Angela was now in recovery, the image of her body on the stretcher replayed in his mind with ruthless precision the rise and fall of her chest that could so easily have stilled forever. Hospitals had their own language of tension, the hiss of oxygen tanks, the clipped voices of nurses, the squeak of rubber soles across polished linoleum. In that language, Edward was a foreigner, but Maya spoke it fluently in the way children sometimes do through fear and silence. She had refused to leave his side. Even after Simone arrived and took charge, Maya's hand continued to seek Edward's sleeve, as though he were the only solid ground left in a world breaking apart. Simone noticed, her gaze both wary and curious. She said little, but Edward could feel the weight of her judgment. Who was this stranger covered in her sister's blood? Why had Maya latched onto him instead of her? When the nurses wheeled Angela out of surgery, her body draped in sheets, tubes at every angle, Maya bolted forward. A nurse gently blocked her, explaining that her mother needed quiet, sterile air, no sudden movement. Maya's lip trembled, her voice barely audible. "But she'll want to know I'm here." Edward crouched beside her, lowering himself until their eyes met. "She knows, trust me, she knows." The child's body sagged as though those words had pressed a release valve. She let Simone guide her back, though her small hand still reached toward the stretcher until Angela disappeared into the ICU. Simone turned to Edward then, her tone brisk. "Doctor DeStranger, she'll be sedated for at least 12 hours. We should take Maya home to rest." Edward nodded, though the word home felt hollow. From the way Maya clung, he doubted she wanted to leave. And he wondered, what did home mean to a child whose world was collapsing in real time? The hospital provided a small room for waiting families, a cot, stale coffee, vending machines buzzing faintly in the corner. Simone busied herself with forms and calls. Edward sat with Maya on the cot, his coat still around her shoulders. She leaned against him with the ease of instinct, as if he had been there all her life. He told himself he should leave. His presence was unnecessary now. Simone was family. She could handle the rest. But each time he shifted, ready to stand, Maya stirred, her grip tightening, her brow creasing even in sleep. So he stayed. Hours later, Simone tapped his shoulder. She finally dozed off. "You should go home. You've done more than enough." "Oh," Edward looked down at the child, her chest rising and falling softly beneath the oversized coat. He shook his head. "I'll stay a while longer." Simone studied him. She was a physician, trained to read symptoms, patterns, motives. She saw a man haunted, carrying a grief he didn't name. She didn't press, but her silence said she recognized it. The rest of the night was a blur of exhaustion. Edward's body ached from the rigid cot, but his mind refused to quiet. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw blood on concrete, headlights slicing through dark, a child's scream echoing. The past and present fused into one endless nightmare, except this time, for reasons he could not explain, he was in the center of it rather than on the outside looking in. By morning, the city was awake again. The sound of traffic seeped through the hospital walls, muffled but insistent. Life going on outside, as though nothing had changed. For Maya, everything had changed. When she finally opened her eyes, she blinked up at Edward with a disoriented frown. "Is Mama awake?" "Not yet," he said gently, "but she's safe. She's resting so her body can heal." Maya nodded, the trust in her gaze striking him harder than any boardroom confrontation ever had. A child who had lost everything in a single night had decided, without question, that Edward was her anchor. Simone reappeared, her coat neatly buttoned, exhaustion etched into her face. "I need to check on Angela." "Maya, you'll come with me." But Maya clung to Edward again. "Can he come too?" Simone hesitated. Hospitals guarded against strangers. Privacy mattered. Yet she saw the way Maya's small body leaned toward him, how Edward's large hand rested protectively without thought. After a pause, Simone sighed. "Fine. But stay outside the ICU. She can't have visitors yet." Edward followed them down sterile corridors lined with glass panels. Machines beeped steadily in rooms on either side. When they reached Angela's door, Edward stopped short. Through the narrow window, he saw her lying still, her chest rising only with the rhythm of machines. The sight pulled at him, dragging him back to another ICU where another bed had been occupied by everything he loved. He had stood helpless. Too late. Now, he stood here. Maybe in time. Maya pressed her hand against the glass. "She looks like she's sleeping." "She is," Simone said softly. "The medicine makes her sleep so her body can mend." Edward swallowed hard. To Maya, it looked simple. Sleep, heal, wake. But he knew better. Life balanced on fragile threads. One cut, and the world unraveled. They returned to the waiting room, Simone making arrangements for shifts, contacts, insurance appeals. Edward sat silently, Maya curled against him once more. He realized then that this was no longer about duty or accident. Something deeper bound him here. A wrong number had reached him, but perhaps there had been no mistake at all. The hospital in daylight was another world. Overnight silence gave way to a grind of efficiency, phones ringing, nurses pushing carts, the air heavy with disinfectant and the faint smell of coffee from a kiosk downstairs. Families shuffled in and out with styrofoam cups clutched in their hands, eyes bleary but alert, waiting for news that might change their lives. For Edward, the hours since Angela's surgery had already changed his. He stood at the admissions desk, Maya's small fingers still laced through his, her head barely reaching the counter's edge. The clerk in pale blue scrubs peered at him through thick glasses, sliding a stack of papers toward him with a kind of indifferent authority. "We need to finalize insurance verification and payment authorization," she said flatly. "Without it, the hospital cannot proceed with post-operative care." "1. I already signed consent," Edward replied, his voice clipped. "Yes, sir. Consent for surgery. This is financial responsibility." She tapped the forms with a ballpoint pen. "Estimated charges for the procedure are $420,000. Recovery care will add more." Maya's grip tightened. Edward glanced down. Her wide eyes flickered between him and the clerk, confusion clouded with fear. The girl was old enough to understand the word money, even if she couldn't grasp the number's enormity. Edward straightened, his jaw set. "Put it under my name. Edward Grant. You'll have your payment before the end of the day." The clerk looked up, startled by the firmness in his tone. She typed furiously on the computer, her expression changing as the system recognized the name. She glanced again at him, this time with a different kind of calculation, recognition, respect, perhaps even a flicker of awe. "Of course, Mr. Grant," she said quickly. "We'll process it immediately." As the forms clicked into place, Edward felt Maya tug his sleeve. She whispered, "That's a lot, isn't it?" He crouched beside her so his words would meet her ears alone. "It is, but money is just paper unless it saves someone's life. And your mother's life is worth everything." Now, Maya studied him with a solemnity that felt far too old for 7 years. Then she nodded once, as if granting approval. Simone appeared just then, her coat still rumpled from a sleepless night. She carried a clipboard of her own, scanning paperwork with the precision of a physician used to bureaucratic battles. "They'll find every reason to delay care," she muttered. "Insurance gaps, missed forms, unpaid balances. They prey on families with no leverage." Edward looked at her, steady. "They won't prey on this family." Simone raised her eyes to him, skeptical but not ungrateful. She had learned to mistrust wealth the way it often bought silence instead of justice, distance instead of connection. Yet here was a man who had arrived from nowhere, already entangled in their crisis, signing papers as though he belonged. "You don't have to involve yourself any further," she said quietly, almost challenging. Edward didn't answer. He only looked at Maya, who leaned against his side, her eyes closing from exhaustion. In that silence, Simone read her niece's dependence and understood the futility of pushing him away. Later, in the ICU hallway, Edward sat beside Simone while Maya dozed on his lap. Angela lay behind the glass wall, machines humming, a ventilator rising and falling in steady rhythm. Doctors moved in and out, their white coats fluttering like flags of authority. Each time the door opened, Edward's muscles tensed. Simone broke the quiet first. "You said you were there. When it happened." "Yes. What were you doing in that neighborhood?" He hesitated. The truth was both simple and impossible. Answering a phone call. Her brows arched. "From Maya?" He nodded. "She tried to call me," Simone said softly. But her hands must have slipped. She was terrified. "I didn't answer until much later." She looked at him intently. "And yet you did." Edward's gaze shifted to the floor. He could not tell her about the ghost that had driven him, the memory of his wife and daughter. He could not explain how the echo of a frightened child had torn through his walls and left him with no choice but to act. So he said the only truth that mattered. "I wasn't going to let her face it alone." Simone regarded him for a long moment. She had spent her life reading faces in emergency rooms: fear, denial, anger, grief. In Edward, she read something rarer, a man running from his own past, trying to anchor himself to a child who wasn't his. A doctor interrupted them, approaching with brisk steps. "She's stable for now," he reported, "but the next 24 hours are critical. If she develops swelling in the brain or further internal bleeding, we'll need additional interventions." Simone nodded, her expression all professionalism. Edward only tightened his hold on Maya, who stirred but didn't wake. When the doctor left, Edward rose and walked toward the glass, pressing his palm lightly against it. Angela lay motionless, her skin almost translucent under the harsh fluorescent lights. For an instant, he imagined the monitors flatlining, the machines silenced, Maya's cry piercing the room. He forced the image away, but it clung stubbornly. A cruel shadow. Simone joined him, her arms crossed. "Why are you really here, Mr. Grant?" He turned his head slightly, his profile sharp against the reflection. "Because I know what it means to be too late." Her lips parted, a question forming, but he offered nothing further. His eyes remained on Angela, the weight of his unspoken confession pressing heavier than any words could carry. That night, after Simone left briefly to gather clothes from her apartment, Edward stayed behind with Maya. He bought her a sandwich from the vending machine, watched her nibble quietly, and when she curled into the stiff chair, he covered her with his coat again. The child's trust was unspoken, but absolute. Edward sat in the dim light of the waiting room, staring at the closed ICU doors. He had power beyond measure in the financial world, but here, none of it mattered. Here, all that mattered was whether one woman's heart kept beating through the night, and he vowed silently, this time, he would not walk away. Night descended again, draping the hospital in heavy shadows. The fluorescent lights glowed relentlessly, pale and unforgiving, while the hum of machines filled every hallway. Edward had not left his post. He remained in the same hard-backed chair outside the ICU, his body weary, his mind a restless storm. Maya slept across 2 chairs, her head on his coat, her thumb curled under her chin like a child much younger than 7. Every so often, she whimpered softly, and Edward would lean forward, ready to comfort her. But mostly she drifted in fragile silence, the innocence of sleep protecting her from reality. Edward envied her that silence. His own mind offered no such reprieve. Memories surged without mercy. He closed his eyes and was back in that winter night years ago, the night that had cleaved his life into before and after. His wife, Claire, had bundled Emily into the car after piano practice. It was supposed to be a simple drive home. Edward had been in a boardroom on the 41st floor of a glass tower, his phone silenced, his calendar overbooked. He had promised Claire he would be home for dinner, but the meeting stretched past 8, then 9. Deals worth billions hung in the balance, and he told himself they could not wait. On the icy road, Claire had driven carefully, Emily humming softly in the back seat. But headlights had flared suddenly in the rearview mirror, an old truck swerving recklessly, a group of men shouting, the sound of fists against the car door. Claire had shielded Emily, panic rising. Then the crash came, metal against metal, the world twisting into screams and shattered glass. By the time Edward reached the hospital, hours later, both were gone. The doctors told him there had been a chance if only someone had acted faster, if only he had been there. He had stood beside 2 bodies, one small, one familiar, their faces pale against white sheets, and he had felt the weight of every missed phone call, every broken promise. The empire he built meant nothing in that moment, nothing at all. Now, in the sterile present, he leaned forward, his hands clasped until his knuckles blanched. Angela's still form behind the glass mirrored Claire's. Maya's fragile figure on the chair mirrored Emily's. History, it seemed, had resurrected itself not as punishment, but as a test. Would he fail again? Would he allow time to snatch another family from him? He rose and walked to the window that looked into the ICU. Angela's face was pale, her body draped in tubes and wires. Machines kept her tethered to the world, their blinking lights like distant stars. He pressed his palm against the glass, his breath fogging faintly. "Stay," he whispered to her, though she could not hear. "Stay, because she needs you. And maybe I do too." Behind him, Simone's voice cut through the quiet. "You haven't slept." He turned slightly. She stood with her arms crossed, a paper cup of coffee in her hand, her eyes sharp but softened by fatigue. "Neither have you," he replied. "I'm a doctor," she said. "Sleep is optional. But you're a stranger who should have left hours ago." Edward glanced back at Maya. "She doesn't think I'm a stranger." Simone studied him for a long moment, then lowered herself into a chair beside him. "You remind me of someone who's running from more than this." He didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence was an admission. Simone leaned back, sipping her coffee. "I've seen people in waiting rooms like you, the ones who stare at those doors as if their entire soul depends on them opening the right way. Some lose themselves here. Others, they find a reason to live." "No." Her words lingered long after she left him to his thoughts. He sat in the dim glow of the corridor, the past and present colliding. Claire's face blurred into Angela's. Emily's laughter merged with Maya's trembling voice. He couldn't separate them anymore. All he knew was that this time, he was here. He wasn't late. He wasn't unreachable. He wasn't hiding in a tower of glass. As the hours dragged on, he found himself whispering a prayer he hadn't spoken in years. Not polished, not formal, just a raw plea to a God he had cursed after the funerals. "Don't take her. Don't take this one. Give the child back her mother." The ventilator hissed steadily in response, a rhythm of fragile hope. Finally, exhaustion pressed him into the chair. His head tilted back, eyes closing, though sleep came only in fits. Each time he drifted, he saw Emily's face, Claire's outstretched hand, headlights glaring. But then he saw Maya too, her hand reaching for his sleeve, her eyes pleading. Those images collided, wove together. until his heart felt both broken and alive in the same beat. And there, in the sterile hallway, Edward understood that the ghosts of his past would never leave him. But perhaps, by standing guard for Maya and Angela, he could stop them from multiplying. Morning filtered through the hospital windows in thin gray streaks, softening the hard glow of fluorescent lights. The world outside stirred awake delivery trucks idling on the street, horns echoing in the distance, but inside, the ICU remained timeless, suspended in the fragile rhythm of survival. Angela lay in her bed surrounded by machines, her breathing still measured by the hiss and release of a ventilator. Edward sat nearby, his body worn, his clothes rumpled, but his presence unmoving. He had not left the hospital since the night of the accident. The chairs were hard, the air recycled, yet none of it mattered. His attention stayed fixed on Maya, who had crawled onto the chair beside him and now dozed, her small hand still curled around his sleeve as though tethering him to her fragile world. When she stirred awake, blinking against the morning light, her first words were not about food or sleep, but about her mother. "Is she awake yet?" Edward shook his head gently. "Not yet. The doctors said her body needs more time to heal." "Nah." Maya's shoulders slumped, disappointment heavy in her tiny frame. But then, after a long pause, she looked up at him with eyes wide and searching. "You're still here?" Her voice carried surprise, as though she had expected him to vanish like so many others had in her short life. The words cut into Edward more than he wanted to admit. "Yes," he said simply, "I'm still here." She studied him, her brow furrowed, as though weighing whether she could trust this truth. Slowly, she inched closer, resting her head against his arm. "You didn't have to stay." Edward swallowed hard. How could he explain the truth? That staying wasn't a choice, it was a vow he had no words for. That he was here not only for her, but for the ghosts that would not leave him. "Sometimes staying is the only thing that matters," he said softly. For a while they sat in silence, broken only by the beeping monitors and the soft shuffling of nurses' feet. Then Maya spoke again, her voice small. "When Mama gets better, she'll want to thank you. She always says we should thank people who help us." Edward felt his throat tighten. "She doesn't owe me thanks. I just did what anyone should have done." Maya tilted her head, her eyes narrowing with a wisdom too old for her years. "But nobody else came when I called." Her words lodged deep. He thought of the strangers who had walked past her mother bleeding on the street, indifferent to the sight of a child crying in the dark. He thought of himself, years ago, unreachable behind glass walls while his own family slipped away. He had been one of those who didn't come. But now, for reasons he still couldn't name, he had answered. Maya leaned back, pulling the coat he had draped around her tighter. "You know, you're the only grown-up who answered my call." The statement was simple, but in it lay a trust Edward hadn't felt in years. It was more binding than any contract he had ever signed. The weight of it pressed against him, demanding something more than wealth or power demanding his heart. He looked at her small face, the faint smudge of dried tears, the stubborn resilience shining through. "Then I guess that makes me responsible," he said quietly. Her lips curved in the faintest smile before her eyes fluttered shut again. She drifted back into sleep, her body relaxing completely against his side. Edward remained still, his thoughts circling. Trust was a fragile gift, one he had broken before. Emily had trusted him to be there, Claire had trusted him to come home, and he had failed them both. Yet here was another child, placing her fragile faith in him without hesitation. It was terrifying, and it was sacred. Across the room, Simone returned from her overnight shift, her expression weary but her stride brisk. She paused when she saw Edward and Maya together, Maya asleep, curled against him as though she had always belonged there. Simone's eyes softened, but her voice was measured when she spoke. "She's taken to you quickly." Edward didn't move. "She doesn't have anyone else right now." Simone studied him, her gaze piercing. "And what about you? Do you have anyone?" The question hung heavy. Edward opened his mouth, then closed it again. The truth was too raw to offer freely. He had no one. Not since that winter night. Not since the graves. Simone seemed to read the answer in his silence. She nodded once, as though satisfied, and lowered her voice. "Angela is strong. If anyone can fight through this, it's her. But Maya will need someone in the meantime. Edward looked down at the child resting against him, her trust an unspoken vow. His hand rested lightly on her small shoulder. She has me. The words slipped out before he realized he had spoken them. And in that moment, he knew they were more than words. They were a promise. The ICU was too quiet. Machines beeped with indifferent rhythm, each tone marking seconds Edward could not control. He sat rigid in the chair, Maya still sleeping against his side. When the sudden shift came, nurses rushed through the glass doors, voices urgent, footsteps rapid. Alarms pierced the sterile air. High-pitched and merciless, Edward was on his feet instantly, his chest clenching. He pressed his hand against the window, staring inside as the medical team swarmed Angela's bed. Orders snapped through the air. BP, dropping. Prepare for transfusion. Call neurosurgery, possible hemorrhage. Simone appeared from the hallway, her coat half on, her face set with the grim calm of a physician who understood too much. She brushed past Edward and demanded the details. He caught fragments, intracranial pressure rising, blood loss uncontrolled, surgery needed immediately. A doctor came to the door, his mask tugged down, eyes urgent. We need immediate consent. The risks are extremely high. If we don't operate now, she won't survive the next hour. Simone's breath caught. She opened her mouth to respond, but Edward's voice came first, sharp and unwavering. Do it. The doctor hesitated. You understand. Sir, mortality is significant. This isn't just routine. We're talking potential permanent damage. Paralysis. Even. I said do it. Edward's tone cut like a blade. Whatever it takes, save her. Maya stirred at the sound of his raised voice, her eyes blinking open. What's happening? She whispered, rubbing sleep from her face. Edward crouched, his hand cupping the back of her head. He forced calm into his voice, though his heart raced. They need to help your mama again. They're fighting very hard for her. Will she die? The question trembled out of her, heavy as a hammer. Edward looked straight into her eyes. In them he saw the reflection of Emily, his own daughter's unasked questions. His throat tightened, but he would not flinch. Not if I can help it. The doctors rushed Angela down the hall, the gurney's wheels clattering against the tile. Edward followed alongside Simone, Maya's small hand clutching his with fierce strength. The sight was brutal, Angela's face pale, her hair damp with sweat, tubes and wires trailing. For Edward, it was too much like déjà vu. Another woman being wheeled away, another chance slipping into the hands of fate. They stopped outside the operating theater. The surgical team vanished inside, and the heavy doors swung shut with a finality that stole Edward's breath. The silence that followed was unbearable. Simone pressed her hand to her forehead, whispering prayers under her breath. She looked at Edward, her eyes fierce. Do you understand what you've just authorized? If she doesn't come out alive, you'll carry that decision forever. Edward's voice was low, almost a growl. I already carry worse. Simone's expression softened slightly, but she said nothing more. Hours crawled by, each minute a stone dragged across Edward's chest. He paced the sterile hallway, his shoes clicking on tile, stopping only when Maya whimpered. Each time, he returned to her, kneeling, whispering reassurances he barely believed himself. At one point, she tugged at his sleeve. Why are you helping us? You don't even know us. Edward paused, caught between truth and silence. Finally, he said, because once, I lost the people I loved most, and I wasn't there to save them. I won't let that happen again. Maya studied him with wide, solemn eyes, as though she understood more than a child should. She reached for his hand, her fingers small and sticky with dried tears. Then don't leave, okay? I won't, he promised. The words hung between them, heavier than any contract he had ever signed. They were not a business deal. They were a vow. When the operating room doors finally swung open, the surgeon emerged, his scrubs soaked in sweat, his expression unreadable. Edward's heart clenched so hard, he thought it might stop. The doctor pulled down his mask. She made it through, he said. The bleeding was extensive, but we managed to relieve the pressure. She's stable for now. Relief hit Edward like a tidal wave. His knees nearly buckled. Beside him, Maya gasped. Her small hands pressed to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. Simone exhaled, her body sagging against the wall. Thank God. Edward closed his eyes, his head bowing. In the darkness behind his lids, he saw Claire and Emily again, but this time they weren't fading away. This time, he had been there. This time, he hadn't been late. The hospital at night was a place between worlds. Shadows pooled in the corners of the waiting room, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, their hum like an endless reminder that sleep was impossible. Outside, the city pulsed with its usual indifference, taxis gliding down rain-slick streets, neon lights flickering above bodegas, strangers hurrying past each other. Inside, Edward sat stiffly in a chair, his coat wrapped around Maya as she slept against him, and the weight of time pressed down on him with a merciless hand. Angela was out of surgery, stable but fragile. The surgeon had spoken in careful terms. She made it through, but the next 24 hours are critical. Edward knew how doctors chose their words. Stable meant not gone yet. Critical meant the ground could still fall away beneath them. It left him in this purgatory of waiting, his heart suspended like a fragile thread ready to snap. Maya shifted in her sleep, murmuring something unintelligible, her small hand gripping the lapel of his suit jacket as though it were a lifeline. Edward glanced down at her, the rise and fall of her chest, the innocence of her face softened by exhaustion. She had been so brave, and yet beneath the bravery was a child who had nearly lost everything in one brutal night. His mind wandered into the abyss he usually avoided. He remembered the nights after Claire and Emily's deaths, when the house was so silent it felt like a tomb. He had sat in the dark of his penthouse, the city spread below like a sea of stars, and wondered how life could continue when his world had ended. Deals still closed, markets still surged, but he had lived inside a coffin of his own guilt. For years he had told himself he survived by burying the past. Now, sitting with this child asleep against him, he realized he had been wrong. The past wasn't buried, it had been waiting. The waiting room around him was a theater of grief. An older couple prayed in whispers, rosary beads clinking softly between their fingers. A young man paced, his jaw tight, eyes hollow, waiting for word of his brother. A mother soothed her teenage son, stroking his hair as he wiped at tears he tried to hide. Edward saw in each of them a mirror of himself. Grief was universal, no respecter of wealth or status. In here, everyone was stripped bare. Simone returned from the ICU corridor, her face weary but professional. She carried 2 cups of coffee, setting one in front of Edward. "You'll need it," she said. Edward nodded, his voice low. "Any change?" "She's holding steady. That's the best we can hope for tonight." Simone sank into the chair beside him, watching him carefully. "You know, most people in your position would have handed this over to family and gone back to their lives." "I'm not most people," Edward said quietly. "No," Simone agreed, her tone laced with both gratitude and suspicion. "You're not. But why?" Edward didn't answer immediately. He stared into the black surface of the coffee, his reflection fractured by ripples. The words pressed at him like a weight, and for once he didn't push them down, because once, I wasn't there when it mattered most, and I will not let that happen again. Simone's eyes softened, though questions lingered. She didn't press. She only said, "Then maybe, this is your chance to make peace with yourself." Her words followed him long into the night as silence crept back over the waiting room. Maya shifted again, waking briefly. She looked up at him, her eyes heavy with sleep. "You won't leave, right?" Edward shook his head. "No, Maya. I won't leave." "No." She sighed and nestled closer, reassured. Hours stretched on, the clock ticking in cruel rhythm. Edward's back ached, his eyes burned, but he stayed. He listened to the beeping monitors echo faintly through the ICU doors, the muted voices of doctors and nurses working in the distance. He let Maya's steady breathing anchor him against the tide of memory threatening to pull him under. At one point, he dozed lightly, only to jolt awake at the sound of a monitor alarm down the hall. His heart thundered until a nurse reassured him it was another patient, not Angela. He closed his eyes, steadying himself, his pulse refusing to calm. When the first gray light of dawn seeped through the blinds, Edward was still in that chair, Maya curled against him. He realized then that he hadn't moved all night, and for the first time in years, he didn't resent the weight of staying. He welcomed it. The first pale wash of dawn had just touched the hospital windows when the alarm sounded. Edward shot upright, his heart hammering, as red lights flashed above the ICU doors. Nurses sprinted past, a crash cart rattling against the linoleum floor. The sharp voice of a doctor carried down the corridor. "She's crashing, get me a line now." Edward froze, his blood running cold. He pressed a hand against the glass window, staring into Angela's room. The stillness of the night was gone, replaced by frantic movement. Doctors clustered around her bed, voices overlapping. The ventilator hissed faster. The steady beeps of the monitor became erratic, and for a moment Edward thought the sound might stop altogether. Maya stirred awake on the chair, her small face still swollen from sleep. She rubbed her eyes, then noticed the commotion. "What's happening?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Edward dropped to his knees in front of her, shielding her from the view. His hands held her small shoulders firmly, anchoring her in place. "They're helping your mama. Right now she's fighting very hard, but the doctors are with her. Do you understand?" Tears welled instantly in her eyes. "She's not going to die, is she?" Edward's throat tightened. The image of Claire lying still on a hospital bed flashed in his mind. The night he had arrived too late. The monitors already flatlined. The silence unbearable. His wife, his daughter, gone in the space of minutes. He had carried that weight ever since, each day built on the rubble of failure. He forced his voice steady, though his chest burned. "She's fighting. And I'm here. You're not alone." Simone appeared beside them, her face pale, her eyes locked on the chaos inside. She was a doctor, but she was also a sister, and her professional mask wavered. "They need to stabilize her," she said tightly. "If they can't," she stopped herself, unwilling to finish the thought. Minutes dragged into eternity. Edward held Maya close, feeling her small body tremble against him. Her sobs soaked into the fabric of his shirt, but he didn't move, didn't let her see the panic in his eyes. Inside, Angela's body was pale, wires snaking everywhere, her chest rising only with the hiss of machines. Nurses called out numbers, blood pressure falling, oxygen saturation dropping. Edward pressed his forehead against the glass, whispering words he hadn't spoken in decades. "Please, not this time. Don't take her. Don't take this child's mother." The past bled into the present until he could barely tell them apart. Emily's eyes. Maya's eyes. Claire's hand, slipping away. Angela's hand now limp on the bed. It was all one story, one punishment replayed, and yet here he was, present when it mattered, not locked in a meeting, not unreachable. Here, watching, praying, demanding. Finally, after what felt like hours, though it was only minutes, the storm inside the room began to settle. The alarm's shrill tone eased back into steady beeps. The doctor barked one last order, then stepped back, pulling down his mask. Angela's chest rose more evenly now, the lines on the monitors stabilizing. Simone exhaled shakily, pressing a hand over her mouth. Edward's entire body sagged with relief. He closed his eyes, his breath ragged. He had been seconds away from seeing another life slip away, another ghost added to the weight he carried. But this time, the line had held. Maya sniffled, looking up at him with watery eyes. "Is Mama okay now?" Edward brushed a tear from her cheek. "She's safe for now." The doctors saved her. The surgeon stepped out moments later, exhaustion etched deep into his features. "We managed to stabilize her," he explained. "It was close, closer than I'd like. The next few hours are still critical, but she's back with us." Maya let out a sob of relief, throwing her arms around Edward's neck. He held her tightly, his own eyes stinging. For years he had been haunted by the belief that he could never save anyone, that he was cursed to watch everything he loved be taken from him. Yet here he was, holding a child who still had her mother because he had stayed, because he had not been too late. Simone's voice cut softly into the moment. "She's not out of danger, but she's fighting, and that means something." Edward nodded, his jaw set. He knew it meant everything. As the hospital settled back into uneasy calm, Edward remained rooted in the chair, Maya still clinging to him. He stared through the glass at Angela, pale but alive, and made a vow in the silence of his heart. He would see this through, whatever it cost him, whatever it demanded. He would not let this family fall apart, not like before. The hours after the code were suspended in a haze of exhaustion and fragile hope. Edward sat motionless in the chair, his gaze locked on Angela through the ICU glass. Maya had fallen asleep again, her cheek pressed to his chest, her tiny breath steady against the fabric of his shirt. Edward's hand rested on her back as though he were afraid she might slip away if he let go. Angela lay beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, her skin pale, tubes and wires mapping the edges of her fight. Machines kept rhythm for her heart and lungs, each beep and hiss a reminder that life was fragile, borrowed, and constantly contested. When morning light crept into the hospital, softening the edges of the sterile room, Edward's eyes burned with sleeplessness. Simone appeared at his side with a coffee in hand, her own face etched with fatigue. "No changes through the night," she murmured. "She's stable, for now." Stable. The word was a brittle rope stretched over an abyss. Edward only nodded, his jaw tight, the ghosts of memory pressing harder. Then it happened. A subtle shift first. A flicker beneath Angela's closed lids, the faintest flutter of her hand against the sheet. Edward straightened. Every nerve pulled taut. The monitors continued their steady cadence, but his eyes were fixed on that movement. "Simone," he said sharply. His voice carried urgency, and Simone turned just as Angela's eyes opened. Not fully, not with strength, but with a fragile searching. A sliver of dark iris glimmered under heavy lids, her lips parted, dry, cracked. Maya stirred in Edward's arms, woken by the sudden energy in the air. She blinked up, saw what he saw, and in an instant, she was fully awake. "Mama!" she cried, scrambling down from his lap and pressing her palms against the glass. "Mama, I'm here." Angela's gaze shifted sluggishly, as if her eyes were heavy stones being lifted. Her lips moved, a whisper escaping. It was faint, but clear enough. "Maya." The sound was ragged, more air than voice, but it carried the weight of survival. Maya gasped, tears flooding her cheeks, and pressed her forehead to the window. "I'm here, Mama. Don't worry. I'm here." Simone rushed to the door, speaking quickly to the attending nurse. Within moments she was inside the room, bending close to her sister, checking vitals, explaining the reality. "You've been through surgery. You're safe now. Don't try to talk too much." But Angela's eyes, still fogged with anesthesia, still heavy with pain, searched past Simone, locking onto the small figure crying at the glass. Her lips shaped the word again, a mother's first instinct rising above every other need. "Maya." The nurse nodded and motioned Maya inside briefly, wrapped in sterile gowns and gloves. Edward remained at the threshold, watching as the child rushed to her mother's bedside. Maya gripped Angela's hand, tiny fingers trembling against skin still cool. Angela's gaze softened, and though her strength was thin, her thumb brushed faintly against Maya's knuckles. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but to Maya it was everything. The little girl sobbed openly, her words tumbling in broken gasps. "I thought I lost you. I called and called, and nobody came. But then he did." She pointed back toward Edward, her eyes wide with gratitude and awe. "He came, Mama. He stayed." Angela's gaze followed the child's gesture. For the first time, her eyes settled on Edward, standing quietly in the doorway. Their eyes met through the thin distance, and something unspoken passed between them: recognition, confusion, and a fragile thread of trust. Edward inclined his head slightly, as if to say, "You're safe. She's safe. Rest." Angela's lips moved, but the sound didn't reach him. Still, he read the word there. "Thank you." Simone touched her sister's shoulder gently. "Save your strength, Ange. You'll have time to speak later." But Angela's gaze lingered on Edward even as her eyes closed again, exhaustion pulling her back into the deep tide of recovery. Maya refused to let go of her mother's hand, even after the nurse urged her to step back. She clung to it with fierce devotion, her small body pressed against the bedrail. Finally, when Angela slipped fully into sleep again, Maya turned and ran back to Edward. She threw her arms around his waist, pressing her face into him. "She knew me," Maya whispered through her tears. "She knew I was here." Edward rested a hand gently on the back of her head, his throat too tight to speak. He only nodded, holding her as if she were the only anchor he had left in the world. And in that fragile moment, as dawn poured through the windows and the machine steadied into a softer rhythm, Edward felt something stir in him, he thought, long dead. Not redemption, not absolution, those were too grand. But something smaller, purer, hope. Angela's room was quiet again. But the silence felt different now. It was no longer the sterile hush of machines fighting to keep her alive, but the tentative stillness of recovery. Sunlight filtered through the blinds in pale bands, striping the floor and the edge of the bed. Angela's face remained pale, her lips dry, but color had begun to return slowly to her cheeks. The steady beep of the monitors had softened into background noise, less menacing than before. Maya sat at her mother's bedside, her small hand wrapped around Angela's fingers as if sheer will could keep her tethered to the world. She whispered stories in a voice too low for anyone else to hear about the corner store, about the wrong phone number, about the man who came. Edward stood by the window, a silent witness, allowing the child her space while his own chest tightened with every fragile rise of Angela's chest. When Angela stirred again, her eyelids fluttering open, Simone was instantly at her side. "Take it slow," Simone murmured, adjusting the bed controls, lifting her sister slightly upright. "You've been through major surgery. You're in the ICU. You're safe." Angela's gaze shifted sluggishly, then settled on Maya. The faintest smile ghosted across her lips. "Baby." The word was barely a breath, but it sent Maya into tears of relief. "I'm here, Mama," Maya said fiercely. "I didn't leave. I stayed. And he stayed too." She gestured back toward Edward, her eyes shining. "He didn't let me be alone." Angela turned her head slowly, her eyes landing on Edward. For a moment she studied him, her expression unreadable. He looked back steadily, resisting the urge to retreat under her scrutiny. "Why?" Angela's voice was faint, but direct. A whisper laced with suspicion. "Why did you stay?" Edward took a breath, his jaw tightening. "Because Maya called. And someone had to come." Angela's eyes narrowed slightly, as though weighing his words, testing their edges. "You don't know us. You're not family." "No," Edward admitted softly, "but I know what it feels like to lose family. I wasn't going to let it happen again." The room fell into quiet after that. Simone studied Edward with her doctor's gaze, her skepticism softened by the sincerity in his tone. Angela turned her eyes back to Maya, brushing her thumb weakly across the child's hand. Gratitude flickered there, mixed with caution. She didn't yet understand who Edward was or why he had answered, but she knew her daughter had not been abandoned in her hour of need. For that, at least, she owed him thanks. Later, when Maya dozed against the edge of the bed, Simone urged Edward into the hallway. "You've done a lot," she said carefully, "but Angela's going to have questions when she's stronger. She'll want to know what this is, what you're doing here." Edward leaned against the wall, exhaustion etched into his features. "I don't have an answer that makes sense," he admitted. "All I know is that I couldn't walk away." Simone regarded him quietly, then nodded. "Angela doesn't trust easily. Life hasn't given her that luxury, but she'll see what Maya already sees if you mean what you say." When Edward returned to the room, Maya stirred and lifted her head. Angela's eyes were still on him, and though suspicion lingered, there was something else too, a fragile thread of gratitude, tentative but real. Her lips parted, her voice fragile as glass. "Thank you." The words were small, almost lost under the beeping monitors, but they struck Edward harder than any accolade he had ever received in his life. He gave a short nod, his throat too tight to answer. That night, after visiting hours ended, Edward sat once more in the waiting room, Maya asleep against his side. He stared out the window at the dark sweep of the city and thought of Claire's voice, long gone, and Emily's laugh, forever silenced. He thought of Angela's eyes, filled with questions, and the word she had whispered. "Thank you." It was more than he deserved, yet it was the first step toward something he had thought impossible, forgiveness not from others, but from himself. Angela's recovery moved slowly. each day a battle between pain and persistence. Her body was weak, but her spirit was sharp, refusing to let her fade into the haze of medication. Edward noticed that about her strength hidden under weariness, a resolve built from years of shouldering weight alone. It was late afternoon when the hospital finally allowed a few extended visitors into her room. Maya had insisted on being there from the moment the doors opened, her small hand wrapped tight around Angela's, as if letting go might undo all the healing that had begun. Edward lingered by the window, giving them space but unwilling to leave entirely. Angela's voice was stronger than before, though still raw. "Baby, you must have been so scared." Maya nodded quickly. "I was, but I called for help." She glanced back at Edward with a shy pride. "And he came." Angela's eyes followed her daughter's gaze, settling on Edward. She studied him with the same suspicion she had shown before. But this time curiosity edged into the look. "You stayed," she murmured. Edward inclined his head slightly. "I told her I would, and I meant it." "Huh." Angela's lips pressed together. Gratitude lived in her eyes, but so did caution. "I don't know what to make of that. People don't usually stay." For a moment the room fell into silence except for the steady hum of machines. Then Angela turned her face toward her sister. "Simone, could you take Maya for a snack? I want to talk with Mr. Grant." Simone raised a brow but complied, guiding Maya toward the cafeteria. The child left reluctantly, casting one last look over her shoulder, as if to be sure Edward wasn't leaving too. Alone with Angela, Edward straightened, unsure what words she would throw at him. She shifted slightly in the bed, pain flickering across her features, but her gaze was steady. "I need to understand. Why? Why sign papers, pay bills, sit here night after night for people you don't know?" Edward inhaled, his chest heavy. "Because I've been where Maya is helpless, waiting for someone who never came. And I swore if I was ever given the chance again, I would not let another child face that alone." Angela blinked slowly, her lips parting as if to speak, but she didn't. Instead, she let out a long breath, her suspicion softening. "Life hasn't been kind," she admitted quietly. "Maya's father left before she was born. I've worked every shift I could, nursing, double hours, weekends just to keep us afloat. Rent, food, school supplies. It's always a fight. And when that car hit me, all I could think was, who will take care of her now?" Edward felt the words lodge deep. He saw in her the reflection of his own failures, the cost of absence, the fragility of family. "You've carried it all alone," he said. Angela gave a short, humorless laugh. "What choice did I have? People talk about community, but when it comes down to it, you're usually on your own. I didn't expect strangers to help, and I sure didn't expect you." Edward moved closer to the bed, lowering his voice. "I can't change what life has done to you, but I can be here now. For you. For her." Angela studied him in silence, searching for cracks, for insincerity. Finally, she whispered, "Maya trusts you." Those 3 words struck harder than any accusation could. Trust was something Edward had lost long ago in others, in himself. Hearing it now felt both like a gift and a burden. "She shouldn't have to," Angela added softly. "Not with someone she barely knows. But I saw her eyes when she looked at you. She sees something." Edward's throat tightened. He forced his voice low and steady. "I won't betray that trust." The door opened then, and Maya bounded back in, a juice box clutched in her hand. She climbed into the chair beside her mother, sipping loudly before saying, "Auntie bought me pretzels too." Her small smile lit the sterile room. Angela brushed a hand weakly over her daughter's braids, her gaze lingering on Edward. Something in her expression had shifted, not full acceptance, not yet, but the beginning of a fragile bridge between suspicion and belief. Edward stood by the window, watching mother and daughter together. For the first time, he felt the heaviness of his past shift slightly, as though sharing her burdens might ease his own. Angela's condition stabilized enough that the doctors began to speak of transferring her from the ICU to a regular recovery ward. It was good news, but it came with complications. The bills continued stacking up, and Angela's job at the nursing home hung in limbo. She couldn't work, and without her income, the small apartment she and Maya shared felt like a ticking clock. How long before the landlord demanded rent that couldn't be paid? Edward overheard Simone speaking to one of the administrators in the hallway. She'll need weeks, maybe months of recovery. She can't climb stairs. She can't lift weight. She'll need daily monitoring. She can't go back to that apartment. When Edward stepped forward, Simone's eyes narrowed. This isn't your burden. Oh, but Edward didn't flinch. It became mine the night Maya called me. Angela's pride bristled when the idea was raised. She shook her head weakly, her voice hoarse but firm. No, I won't be anyone's charity case. We'll manage. Maya, sitting beside her bed, frowned deeply. Mama, you can't even walk yet. How are we going to manage? Her voice cracked, caught between childhood innocence and the crushing weight of adult fear. Edward crouched beside Maya, his eyes steady on Angela. This isn't charity. It's what anyone should do for people who need help. I have a penthouse with more empty rooms than I'll ever use. Stay there until you're strong again. Let me make sure Maya has food, a safe place, and you have what you need to heal. Angela's lips pressed tight. She wanted to refuse. Her whole life had been a battle to stay independent, to prove she could survive without handouts. But Maya's wide eyes, desperate and pleading, softened her resistance. Finally, she whispered, just until I'm strong enough to walk out of here. Edward inclined his head. Just until then. The transfer happened 2 days later. Angela was moved from the ICU to a private room, and when the doctors cleared her for discharge, Edward's car waited at the hospital entrance. It wasn't one of the sleek black vehicles his wealth afforded him, just a practical SUV he'd sent for comfort's sake. Maya's eyes grew wide at the leather seats and quiet hum of the engine, her small hands tracing the stitching as though she had entered another world. Angela sat beside her daughter, her body frail, leaning heavily against the seatbelt. She stared out the window, silent, as the city blurred by. Edward drove without speaking, giving her the dignity of quiet. When they arrived, Maya's gasp broke the silence. The penthouse loomed above them, a glass tower catching the afternoon sun, its surface shimmering. Mama, she whispered, tugging Angela's sleeve. It looks like the buildings in the movies. Inside, the elevator opened into Edward's world-high ceilings, polished wood, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. The air carried faint scents of leather and fresh lilies arranged by a housekeeper earlier that day. Maya ran forward, her footsteps echoing on marble floors, her laughter filling the vast empty space. Angela's eyes darted across the luxury, suspicion flickering. She turned to Edward, her voice edged. This is too much. Edward shook his head. It's just a place. A place is only worth what it gives to the people in it. Let it be a shelter until you're ready to return home. Maya tugged her mother toward the wide windows. Look, Mama, you can see the river from here, and the park. It's so high up. Angela's resolve softened as she watched her daughter's wonder. For the first time since the accident, Maya's face held joy untainted by fear. Angela lowered herself into a chair, exhaustion washing over her, and whispered, maybe, for a little while. Edward stood a few feet away, his hands resting in his pockets. He didn't intrude. He only watched, his heart caught between relief and the ache of memory. He remembered bringing Emily home once to a space much like this, her laughter filling rooms that now only echoed with silence. Tonight, those echoes felt lighter, softened by new voices. Later, after Simone helped settle Angela into the guest suite and left to tend her own shift, Edward found himself alone in the living room. Maya appeared, clutching a blanket, her bare feet padding across the cold floor. Can I sleep here? She asked, pointing to the couch. It feels safer with you nearby. May. Edward nodded, unfolding the blanket over the cushions. Of course. She curled into the couch, small and fragile, and within minutes she was asleep, her breathing steady. Edward sat in the armchair across from her, watching the child who had called him by mistake yet drawn him into her world with absolute trust. Through the glass windows, the city glowed beneath him, but for the first time in years, Edward felt no loneliness in the height of his tower. He felt the fragile warmth of something returning: connection, responsibility, maybe even family. And in the quiet, he whispered a vow only the night could hear. You will not face this alone. Not her. Not you. Not this time. Angela sat in the guest suite, sunlight streaming through curtains that looked more expensive than any furniture she'd ever owned. The bed was wide and soft, its linen crisp and cool. A tray of breakfast rested on the side table: fresh fruit, scrambled eggs, and toast cut neatly into triangles. It was the kind of meal she would have rushed to prepare for other people in her nursing shifts, but never had time or money to make for herself. She ate slowly, her body still weak, her pride even weaker. Every bite was both nourishment and a reminder. This was not her home. This was a stranger's penthouse, a world she didn't belong to. Her gratitude warred with resentment. She didn't want her daughter to see her indebted, fragile, leaning on a man they barely knew. From the open door, Angela heard Maya's laughter. The sound startled her. It had been so long since she'd heard that tone, full and unburdened. She rose carefully, leaning on her crutches, and followed the sound into the living room. There, Maya was sprawled on a plush rug. Colored pencils scattered around her as she drew pictures of the city skyline. Edward sat on the floor nearby, his suit jacket draped over the couch, sleeves rolled up. He wasn't giving instructions or watching from a distance. He was drawing too, sketching crooked little stars that made Maya giggle. Yours look funny, Maya said between giggles. They're abstract, Edward replied dryly, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. Angela lingered at the doorway, her eyes narrowing at the sight. Something in her chest tightened, a mix of gratitude, suspicion, and something softer she dared not name. She cleared her throat. Both heads turned. Maya sprang up instantly. Mama, look, he's drawing with me. Angela forced a smile. I see. Her gaze shifted to Edward. Thank you for keeping her busy. She's keeping me busy, he said, rising smoothly to his feet. His tone was calm, but his eyes lingered on Angela's crutches, her cautious steps. How are you feeling? Like someone cut me open and stitched me back together, she replied flatly, lowering herself onto the couch. Edward inclined his head, accepting her bluntness without comment. He gestured toward the breakfast tray Simone had insisted she finish. You'll need your strength. Angela bristled slightly. I've been taking care of myself and Maya for years. I know how to heal. Maya looked between them, sensing the tension, then quickly sat beside her mother. Mama, can we stay here until you're better, please? It feels safe. Angela stroked her daughter's hair, her lips tightening. It's not our home, baby. Edward's voice was quiet but steady. Home is where you're safe, where you're cared for. That's all that matters right now. Angela met his gaze, searching for condescension, for pity, but what she saw instead was something else entirely: an emptiness, an ache she recognized because she carried it too. She lowered her eyes, unwilling to give him more ground. That evening, Simone stopped by after her hospital shift, bringing Angela's medical records and a bag of clothes. She watched as Maya bounded to the kitchen, chattering about the big fridge, stocked with more food than she'd ever seen at once. Simone pulled Angela aside, her voice low. She's blooming, Ange. Look at her. She feels safe here. Angela sighed, her pride bristling. That's the problem. She's starting to think this is her life. But it's not. We don't belong in glass towers. Simone studied her sister, her tone softening. And what's wrong with letting her taste safety, even if it's borrowed? You've fought alone for so long. Maybe it's okay to let someone else shoulder the weight for a while. Angela's eyes flicked to Edward, who was setting plates on the dining table, his movements quiet, unassuming. He didn't look like a man flaunting wealth. He looked like someone trying to fill an emptiness with simple acts. That night, after Maya had fallen asleep in her new room with a window that looked out over the glowing city, Angela sat awake in the guest suite. The skyline glittered through the glass, mocking and mesmerizing all at once. She whispered into the quiet, her hand pressed over her stitches. Just until I can walk out of here on my own. Just until I can take her back. Oh, yet even as she said it, she felt the weight of uncertainty. For the first time in years, her daughter was laughing freely. For the first time in years, She was not alone in the fight. And that truth cut sharper than pride. The city glowed beneath the penthouse windows, a scatter of gold against the dark sky. Edward stood alone in the living room, hands in his pockets, his reflection faint in the glass. Behind him, the apartment was quiet. Maya tucked into bed, her soft breathing carried faintly through the half-open door. Angela resting in the guest suite, though Edward suspected she was awake, her mind restless. He rarely let himself stand still long enough for memory to creep in, but tonight it came uninvited. He could almost hear Emily's laughter echoing in these rooms, though she had never stepped foot in them. He could almost see Claire's figure at the window, her eyes reflecting the skyline, the way she used to tease him about working late. And then he saw them in that hospital, pale beneath white sheets, gone because he had been late, the images pressed like thorns against his chest. Beautiful view. Angela's voice startled him. He turned quickly. She stood in the doorway, leaning on her crutches, dressed in the simple cotton robe Simone had brought. She looked tired, her face still pale from surgery, but her eyes were alert, taking him in. "You shouldn't be up," Edward said gently. She gave a small shrug. "I couldn't sleep. Too quiet. Hospitals make you used to noise." She moved carefully to the sofa and lowered herself onto it, with a quiet groan. "And besides, I don't like being in someone else's home without knowing who they are." Edward hesitated, then crossed the room and sat in the armchair across from her. The distance between them was small, but it felt like a gulf of trust neither knew how to cross. Angela's gaze was steady. "Maya tells me you never left her side, that you carried her through the hospital nights, that you kept your promise." "I did what anyone should," he replied softly. Angela shook her head. "No. Most people don't. People walk past. People forget. I've lived long enough to know that staying is rare." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "So what are you running from, Mr. Grant?" Edward's throat tightened. Few dared to ask him directly, and fewer still waited for an answer. He looked down at his hands, flexing them as though the truth were written there. For a long time he said nothing. Then the words came, rough and unpracticed. "I had a wife and a daughter." His voice faltered on the word daughter, but he pushed on. "One night, years ago, I was late, just late enough. They died in a crash I should have stopped. If I had been there, maybe they'd still be alive." Angela's expression softened, suspicion giving way to something gentler. She leaned forward slightly, gripping the crutch at her side. "You blame yourself." "I don't just blame myself," Edward said bitterly. "I live inside it. Every day since, I've built walls higher than this tower, filled them with deals, numbers, noise, anything to drown the silence, but it doesn't go away." He exhaled slowly, his voice breaking. "When Maya called me, it was her voice. A little girl crying into the phone. I heard Emily. I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't be late again." The silence stretched. Angela's eyes glistened, though her voice was steady. "So you stayed because of them." Edward met her gaze, his own eyes raw. "At first, but now, I stay because of you, because of her, because it feels like maybe I'm not too late anymore." Angela looked down at her lap, her fingers trembling against the fabric of her robe. "You talk like a man who's lost everything, but you're still here. That means something." Edward swallowed hard. "Does it? Or am I just clinging to someone else's family to make up for mine?" Her eyes lifted back to his, clear and unflinching. "Maybe both. But Maya doesn't care why you stayed. She only knows you did. And that matters more than reasons." They sat in silence then, two people carrying different burdens but recognizing the weight in each other. For Edward, the confession had cracked something open. He had spent years encased in silence, never speaking their names aloud. Tonight, in this quiet room with Angela's steady gaze, he had. When Angela finally rose to her feet, bracing on her crutches, she paused. "Get some sleep, Edward. You can't carry ghosts and the living both if you don't rest." He nodded, watching her move carefully down the hall. The shadows followed her, but so did a faint light. For the first time in years, Edward felt the armor around him shift. Not broken, not gone, but cracked enough to let something through. The penthouse slowly began to echo with sounds it had not known in years. Laughter, small feet running across hardwood floors, the clatter of crayons dropped onto marble countertops. Maya had discovered corners of the apartment that Edward himself had forgotten, window seats that framed the skyline, a library filled with books no one had touched in years, and a piano that had remained silent since Claire was alive. It was the piano she loved most. Her small fingers pressed tentative keys, creating broken melodies that stumbled but never failed to make her smile. "Mama, hear that? It sounds like the movies," she called, her voice carrying down the hall. Angela, resting in the guest suite with her crutches propped nearby, listened to the music with a heart caught between ache and relief. Her daughter's joy was a gift, but it unsettled her too. Safety here felt too easy, too foreign. She feared the day it would all be taken away. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon and the city lit itself in gold and amber, Edward returned from a short meeting. He found Maya in the library, curled in a chair with a book spread across her lap. She looked up and beamed. "I'm reading about stars." "Did you know some are already dead but still shining?" Edward paused, struck by the poetry of it. He sat across from her, his voice soft. "Yes, light can outlive the star itself. It travels for years before fading." Maya tilted her head. "So maybe people are like that too. Maybe when they're gone, their love still shines." The words pierced him. He swallowed hard, his chest tightening. "Maybe you're right, Maya." "Nah." Angela appeared then, leaning on her crutches. She watched her daughter's bright face, then glanced at Edward. "You're teaching her things I never had the time to." Edward shook his head. "She's teaching me." Angela lowered herself into a chair with a quiet sigh. "You're making her happy. I can't deny that. But Edward, children remember. They hold on to hope longer than they should. I don't want Maya to grow used to a life that isn't hers." He met her gaze steadily. "A life where she's safe, cared for, able to laugh. Why shouldn't that be hers?" Angela's lips pressed into a thin line. "Because when we leave, it will break her heart, and I won't let her carry that wound." Edward leaned forward, his voice low, almost raw. "And if you don't leave? What if this isn't temporary?" The room fell into silence, heavy and charged. Angela looked at him, suspicion flickering, pride bristling. She wanted to reject the notion outright, to protect herself from the risk of depending on someone like him. Yet the evidence lay in Maya's joy, in the peace that had settled over her daughter's small body each night. Later, after Maya had fallen asleep in her new room with glow-in-the-dark stars Edward had ordered for her ceiling, Angela stood at the window, the skyline reflecting in her eyes. Edward joined her quietly, the space between them filled with words unsaid. "You know what scares me most?" Angela whispered. "Not the accident, not the surgery. It's that she's happier here than she's ever been. And I don't know if that's mercy or cruelty." Edward looked at her, his voice steady. "Maybe it's neither. Maybe it's a second chance for all of us." Angela turned her face away, but not before he saw the shimmer of tears in her eyes. In the silence that followed, Edward felt the fragile thread of trust between them stretch, not breaking, not yet binding but real. The days blurred together, each one a step further from the nightmare of the accident. Angela's strength returned in slow increments, her stitches healing, her steps surer with the crutches. She could sit longer, breathe deeper, speak without fading into exhaustion. But with every improvement came the shadow of a choice. When she was strong enough, what then? Maya had already made her choice. She thrived in the penthouse, filling its hollow spaces with laughter and light. Each morning she rushed to the windows to see if the city had changed overnight, as though skyscrapers might move like trees in the wind. She drew pictures of Edward and Angela together, stick figures holding hands, always with a small girl smiling between them. When she showed them proudly, Angela's heart clenched. Children spoke their desires in drawings, and Maya's spoke louder than words. One evening, Angela called Edward into the guest suite. She sat at the edge of the bed, her crutches leaning nearby, her eyes steady. "We need to talk." Edward entered quietly, the gravity in her voice pulling him inward. "Of course. You've done more than anyone could ask," Angela began, her tone measured. "You saved my life. You gave Maya safety when I couldn't, but I can't stay here forever. I won't let her grow up thinking this is hers when it isn't." Edward studied her, his hands folded loosely before him. "And what if it could be hers? What if it could be yours?" Angela's brow furrowed. "You don't know what you're offering. You don't know us." "I know enough," Edward said firmly. "I know a little girl's voice reached me when no one else answered. I know her courage pulled me out of a life I'd buried myself in. And I know that being here, with you both, feels like the first time I'm not too late." His words hung in the room, heavy with sincerity. Angela's eyes softened, but pride still held her voice taut. "And when you decide you've done enough, when the guilt fades, when the memory of your family doesn't ache so sharply, what then? Do we become another chapter in your history of loss?" Edward stepped closer, his voice low, raw. "I lost my wife and daughter because I wasn't there. That wound will never fade. But you and Maya, this—" He gestured gently toward the doorway, where faint laughter still echoed from the other room. "This isn't about guilt. It's about choosing to stay, not because I have to, because I want to." Angela looked down at her hands, trembling slightly in her lap. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to let herself lean on someone for once. But trust was fragile, and her daughter's heart was even more so. Maya appeared then, as if summoned by their silence. She carried another drawing. This one simple. 3 figures under a roof. A sun shining above. "This is us," she announced proudly. "Mama, me, and him." She pointed at Edward with a grin. "Our family." Angela's throat tightened, tears welling unbidden. She pulled her daughter close, kissing the top of her head. Edward's gaze met hers over the child's curls, and for a moment neither spoke. No promise could be louder than Maya's picture. That night, when Maya was asleep, Angela found Edward again by the window, staring out at the city lights. She stood beside him, leaning on her crutches, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't promise I won't be afraid. I can't promise I won't push you away when pride gets the better of me. But if you mean what you say, if you really want to stay." Edward turned to her, his eyes steady, his voice a vow. "I will stay. Not as a savior, not as charity. As a man who wants to build something again, even if it's fragile, even if it scares us both." Angela's breath hitched. For years she had survived by fighting alone, by hardening herself against disappointment. Tonight, she let a sliver of that armor fall. She whispered, "Then maybe we can try." Edward nodded, not pushing further, only standing beside her as the city shimmered below. For the first time in years, he didn't feel haunted by what he had lost. He felt anchored by what might still be found. Maya stirred in her sleep down the hall, her small voice carrying faintly into the quiet. "Mama." "Edward." Angela's hand brushed against Edward's as they stood at the window, neither pulling away. The silence between them was no longer heavy with grief, but alive with possibility. And in that fragile beginning, under a skyline that had witnessed both his ruin and his rebirth, Edward Grant found something he thought he would never feel again: family. The story reminds us that life often gives second chances, though not in the way we expect. Edward could never undo the loss of his wife and daughter, but through a trembling call from a child, he was offered a chance to choose differently, to stay, to protect, to love again. It teaches that redemption is not found in wealth or power, but in showing up when it matters most. Sometimes the greatest act of justice, the purest form of love, is simply refusing to walk away.